Welcome back. My name is Dr. Baird, and today I'll be teaching you how to perform the deadlift. So the deadlift is one of the best exercises to build full body strength to limit impact on your joints for less pain and arthritis as you get older. But the reality is, if you don't have a solid understanding of how to perform the movement before you go and lift heavy weight off the ground, it can actually cause more pain, which is what we want to avoid. So in this video, what I'll be doing is taking you through a step-by-step approach to teach you what you need to know to perform the deadlift without pain and without injury, and you can feel confident adding this movement into your routine. So let's go ahead and get started. The very first movement that you have to understand if you want to perform a deadlift is the hip hinge exercise. Before you go start lifting heavy weights off the ground, it's really important that you know how to bend forward while maintaining a neutral spine. So let me just demonstrate the hip hinge. It's pretty simple, but there are a few things you want to pay attention to. So what the movement looks like is this. I'm bending forward while keeping a nice and neutral spine. So a few things that you want to keep in mind as you perform this movement. One is that the movement is sending my hips backwards. So I'm reaching my hips towards the back wall, and I'm not bending forward at my hips here. This is technically a hip hinge, but my center of gravity is drawn so far forward. If I were to add any sort of weight, that's going to be a lot of stress on my low back. So really make sure that you know how to reach those hips back. Two, you have to know how to keep a neutral spine, another term that you should learn and understand if you're looking to deadlift. So when I'm reaching my hips back, I'm maintaining all the curves in my spine. So I'm not going so low that I start to round at my low back. That's going to cause a problem. Or in people that are flexible, what can happen as they reach their hips back, they overextend at the mid back and they over-exaggerate those arches, which is also going to cause problems. So when you perform the hip hinge, it's really important that you pay attention to your spinal positioning. So as I'm sending my hips back, I'm keeping that nice neutral spine. And the last thing that you want to pay attention to, and this is sort of the hardest to understand, is the hip hinge is not a squat. So there's not a lot of knee movement. I'm going to allow my knees to bend, but not actively bend them. So what I don't want is just a stiff-legged, I'm sending my hips back, but my knees are locked out or stay straight. That's not what we're looking for. You're going to allow your knees to bend as you send those hips back. But again, I'm not actively bending my knees. This is what a lot of people do when they're learning the hinge. This is more of a squat where I'm bringing my hips down. The hinge is sending the hips back. So I'm allowing the knees to bend. They're not locked out or they're not actively bending down like that. So that is the hip hinge exercise. Super important that you have a solid understanding and can perform before you go and try to perform the deadlift. The next exercise is called the banded hip hinge. So all this does is it adds a little bit of resistance to your hip hinge movement, which is going to be really important for you to learn how to maintain that neutral spine as there's resistance pulling you down to the ground. It becomes a little bit more difficult versus just doing it with your body weight. So to perform the weighted hip hinge or banded hip hinge, I like to have a full body exercise resistance band. You step right on the middle, holding on to the sides right at your hips, feet about hip width apart. And then from there, you're just going to perform the same hip hinge that we did earlier, but the band provides a little bit of resistance. So it's sending my hips back and maintaining that neutral spine. So what I like to teach my clients while we're performing this exercise is pay attention to when you feel that tension in your hamstrings, because this is going to tell you when to stop. So right about there, I feel tension in the hamstrings. Now I can go lower. That's when my back really starts to round. So we want to make sure that we stop right when we feel that tension in the hamstrings and come back up. And just like the hip hinge, it's all about maintaining that strong spinal position as you perform it. So give that one a try and let me know how it goes. The elevated kettlebell deadlift is the next exercise that we want to learn to teach us how to deadlift safely and effectively. And it's going to be very similar to the hip hinge movements we've done previously, only now we're actually lifting a weight from an elevated surface. So we're actually starting to lift weight. So to perform, I've got my kettlebell on 3 yoga blocks. You can use any sort of step, but you want to make sure that you can get your feet on the outside. So I don't want to start too far back and have to reach forward because that's going to put pressure on my back. I want to start with my feet on each side, and then all I'm going to do is perform the same hip hinge that we've been practicing, sending the hips back, keeping that neutral spine, but now I'm grabbing the weight, and when I stand up, I bring the weight with me. And then to set it back down, it's the same thing. I send my hips back, keeping a nice neutral spine as I perform this movement. So you want to make sure that you feel comfortable lifting, but then also setting the weight down. So make sure that that weight is pulling you straight down and it's not traveling forward this way. The kettlebell should be in a nice straight line, up and down. And that is the elevated kettlebell deadlift. So once you feel confident with the hip hinge, the banded hip hinge, and the elevated kettlebell deadlift, now we can start to transition to lifting weight from the ground, like in a traditional deadlift. Now, I always start my clients off with a kettlebell deadlift because you can start with a lighter weight and really make sure that you understand this movement pattern before you start adding heavier weight like you can with a barbell deadlift. So there's a few things that you have to keep in mind when you're lifting weight from the ground. We're going to start with your feet on the outside of the weight, just like the elevated kettlebell deadlift. You're going to perform the same hip hinge, so I'm sending my hips back, paying attention to my strong spinal positioning, but you'll see once I feel tension in my hamstrings, that's my cue to stop, but I can't reach the weight. So this is where we have to start getting our knees involved. So to get the rest of the weight down, that's when I bend my knees to get to the weight. And so from here at the bottom position, all I have to do is make sure I have a nice straight spine position, brace my abs, and then press through the feet to come straight up. Now, getting the weight down is just as important as getting it up. So you do have to pay attention. I'm going to perform that same hip hinge. And once I feel that tension in the hamstrings, then bend my knees to get the weight the rest of the way down. So a few things to keep in mind with this one. One is the movement of the kettlebell. You still want to be straight up and down. So when I perform this and I press up, the kettlebell moves in a straight line up. And then when I set it down, it's pulling me straight down. I don't want the kettlebell traveling forward at all. That's a sign that your center of gravity is getting too far forward and it's going to put stress on your back. Now, the other thing is at the bottom position, I like to teach my clients how to develop tension in the hamstring and the glutes because we want to make sure that those are the muscles that are lifting the weight and not our lower back. So at the bottom position, sometimes I'll have my patients just gently lift their hips up. That's going to create tension in the hamstrings, and from there, you can press through the feet to stand straight up. So that is the kettlebell deadlift. Just a reminder, start with the lighter weight, and as you feel comfortable, you can move to a heavier weight. Give that a try. Let me know how it goes. Once you feel strong and confident with the kettlebell deadlift, now it's safe to transition to the barbell deadlift. A few things to keep in mind when we perform this is one, I do recommend starting with a light weight until you really get a hang of the movement. But with that being said, you do want these bigger bumper plates. So you don't want to make the mistake of like say a 5-pound bumper plate that are really small because that brings the barbell closer to the ground, which makes it harder to reach. You have to get in bad positions to be able to reach it. So I recommend most people start with 10 on each side of these big bumper plates. So I've got 10 pounds on each side plus a 45-pound barbell. So that's 65 pounds total, which is a great place to start for any beginner. Now, to perform the movement, it's very similar to the kettlebell deadlift, only now the kettlebell's not right between my feet. The bar is slightly out in front. But it's going to be performed very similarly. So I'm going to start with my feet about hip width apart. I'm going to perform the same hip hinge, which is why we've been practicing it so much, sending those hips back. Once I feel tension in the hamstrings, then I bend the knees. I grab the bar with my hands on the outside of my knees. So at the bottom position, what we want to focus on is getting the hips down and your chest up. And then you're going to press through your feet to lift the bar. And at least while you're learning, the goal is to keep that bar as close as possible. So I'm lifting right till I get to my knees, and then I do my hip hinge to get the weight up. And to get it down, again, just as important, keeping the bar as close to your body as possible. You're going to perform that hip hinge with the bar sliding down my thighs. Once it crosses my knees, then I can start to bend my knees to get the weight all the way to the floor. So like I mentioned earlier, make sure you start with a lighter weight, really paying attention to completing this movement with perfect form, paying attention to spinal positioning and developing tension in the hamstrings before you start to add heavier weight. But there you have it. That is a step-by-step approach to learning how to deadlift. I hope that helps. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I am here to help. Thanks so much. Hey guys, it's Dr. Baird here, and I wanted to thank you for watching our previous video and supporting our channel. Now, if you're somebody who's looking to build strength to solve joint pain, keep active, and maintain your lifestyle as you get older, be sure to subscribe to our channel to watch all of our new videos. You won't find it anywhere else.